Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. My name's Dr. Mark Roothouse from the History Department at the University of York, and tonight I'm speaking to you from Acomb. Who knew? I'm not on campus because, of course, we're here on Zoom, and hopefully many of you are joining us from around the UK and perhaps beyond. Tonight, I have the great pleasure of introducing our speaker. But before I get to that, I really need to just take you through a few housekeeping things. So a few technical notes. If you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. It's available throughout the event, so questions can be asked at any time. However, this is an in-conversation, so I'll be talking with our speaker, Hannah, and I might not always be picking up your questions immediately and feeding them into our conversation. And my plan is to take your questions towards the end of our conversation. Should you have any technical issues such as loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again. Subtitles are available for this event, so to turn these on or off, use the CC Live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So now, without further ado, enough from me, and I'd like to introduce Hannah Rose Woods, who is a writer and cultural historian. She has a PhD from the University of Cambridge, where she taught modern British history, and in 2016 captained her college team to victory on that most nostalgic of television programmes, University Challenge. It was Peterhouse, I believe, wasn't it, Hannah? It was.
Hi.
So we're delighted to welcome you this evening, and you're going to talk to us about, I believe I have my copy here, well thumbed and a little bit battered, of Rural Nostalgia, a backwards history of Britain.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
No, thank you. So I wanted to start off by just asking you, for our audience who may not have had the chance to read your book, which you really should, all of you who are listening in today, what would you say is the kind of key driving argument behind it, or the point that you would like them to take away?
Yeah, so the book is a backwards tour through 500 years of British history, told through the ways in which we look back and have historically looked back to the national past. So I kind of begin with the culture wars in the present day, and then I travel back step by step in time towards the Reformation of the 16th century. And I think really what I wanted to get across was that nostalgia has always been with us. I think we often have a sense that, nostalgia in Britain is a product of recent years and recent decades, and something that's kind of built over the second half of the 20th century and carried into the 21st. And, I think it's kind of, in a lot of people's minds, linked to decolonization and deindustrialization, the kind of shrinking down of Britain's global ambitions. But really, and that is definitely a part of my story that I tell in the book. But I also wanted to show that, nostalgia has always been with us. There has always been both this kind of idealized looking back to a kind of glorious and glittering past. And, people have always felt huge anxieties about decline. And I really wanted to kind of harness nostalgia's perpetual backwards glance itself, and to say, well, nostalgia doesn't give us an accurate perspective on what life was like in the past, but the different ways in which people at different times have idealized different aspects of the past, that can tell us a huge amount about how people viewed the changing societies in which they lived.
One of the things I was particularly taken with as a historian myself, and who also published a book, and congratulations on the first book, it's a fantastic read, is how you decided to structure it, because it is one of the unusual things that you have, as you said just then, taken a history and sort of written it backwards. Now, I'm very much used to writing history forwards and following the arrow of time, but you've reversed it. Yeah. What was the choice behind that? Did it just feel right for the material, and what challenges did that throw up for you?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because, as you say, it's my first book, so I've not actually written a book in the normal chronology that history is written. But, I think I kind of got the idea for the structure at the same time as the idea for the subject matter. It just kind of seemed to fit because, of course, nostalgia is just an inherently backwards looking emotion and a backwards looking gaze. But, I think as well, there's huge amounts of continuity in people's nostalgias. For example, throughout the 20th century, people have been, very anxious about urbanization and suburbanization and the loss of Britain's natural landscape and, the kind of shrinking of the countryside. But I kind of wanted to show that actually, there's nothing actually particularly new about that, even if we go back, say, to the 18th century or even before, people were also expressing real anxieties about the changing landscapes in which they lived. I think there just is, I really just kind of wanted to highlight in a way the irony of our perpetual nostalgia, that when we idealize the past, we look back to people and we forget that they themselves were looking backwards too.
One of the things I've particularly enjoyed, because I think we're slightly different generations, and I really loved the bit at the beginning of the book where you talk about Herbert Butterfield, and you look at how Herbert Butterfield's ways of looking changed as he aged. Butterfield, for those of you who don't know and haven't yet read the book, was a very well-known British historian who attacked what he called a Whig view of history. And that was him when he was in his 30s, as you point out. And then he returned to these kind of topics in the 40s, and his views changed on nostalgia. And I wondered whether you had reflected on whether how your views might change on nostalgia as you age.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I am a really nostalgic and a really sentimental person, but I'm also a historian. So, it's my job really to kind of, to kind of interrogate both my feelings about the past and other people's feelings, my sources, feelings about the past, but also, to kind of have a skeptical, inquiring perspective on that. But I also, I think I was very aware when I was writing the book that, I am a relatively young historian. I'm someone at the start of my 30s. And I think the debates that we're having about British history are very often in the media pitted as a kind of intergenerational battle for British identity. And, that's kind of typically cast as, old generations feeling very attached to a story that they feel, immense pride in British history and pride in British identity. And I think it's very easy to cast younger generations as kind of thoughtlessly slaying idols and, kind of tearing down statues. And I think I didn't want to be snarky in kind of debunking some of these myths. I wanted to really acknowledge that they have huge emotional power for people. And, nostalgia is, a universal part of the human condition. It's something we all feel. I didn't want to be dismissive of that. But what I do think it is important for us to do as historians is to say, it's we can all feel nostalgic, but that's very different from kind of mapping our own personal feelings onto the national past. And, it shouldn't feel like an existential threat to, find out that things are more complicated than we'd first been told.
You raise an interesting point now about the intergenerational nature of this, because I was thinking about this, how I'm reflecting on your book, and just wondering how nostalgia has changed over time, and in the sense how the fact that we now have a lot more generations with a lot longer memory present simultaneously, how that has changed the nature of nostalgia, and that there might be competing visions of this. We were talking briefly before this, everyone, when I was talking about my kids who are madly nostalgic for the 1980s, a decade I lived through, because they're all watching Stranger Things at the moment on Netflix. And of course, it's a nostalgia for an American 1980s that was never a 1980s experience here. So how do you think that has changed? I mean, how does demography play into this? The fact that there are many more generations now and different forms of nostalgia.
Well, I think it's been an absolute gift to to capitalism, really. I think, like, say if we look at cinema, and kind of superhero reboots that are drawing on kind of older generations that first experienced superheroes in comics, and then say, like, we had our like first wave about 15 years ago of superhero films, and now there's nostalgia for that wave now, in the way that franchises, for example, hark back. I think there kind of is, in a way, like something for everyone there. So no wonder it's become such a pervasive part of our culture. But yeah, I'm not quite sure I know what to do with it, but as a historian, but I am quite fascinated by the way in which kind of time is almost flattened. I'm not quite sure what, sometimes I see things that I think, well, that's definitely nostalgic, but I think, well, what's it nostalgic about? I walked into Urban Outfitters the other day, which it's not a shop I'd been to for a while, definitely, aimed at, a micro generation below me. And I thought, well, all the clothes are kind of definitely harking back to the 90s, but they're harking back to a 90s in a way that was harking back to the 70s. And yeah, just some very kind of curious mismatches.
That's a really fascinating thing, because again, reflecting on the book and just thinking about how you structured it and the chronologies, one of the things that's really noticeable, just sort of flicking through, is how the time period shortened. And so that there are these long periods of time when people have a fairly, at least as you present it, and this stuff far better than I do, have a very stable understanding of what it is they're harking back to. And then we move into the 20th century, and it seems to be the cycle seems to speed up.
Yeah.
Did you feel that? And what's your sort of take on why that might be?
I mean, I think kind of yes and no, because every age has viewed its own as one of unprecedented change. We felt for a very long time that the world is speeding up. But I think as well, I don't necessarily, it's interesting you say that, is it? Because I've been asked that question when I've done events before, and I'm not sure I quite see it that way. I think people have always kind of looked back to the very recent past as well as the distant past and idealize both, and it's the kind of bit in the middle that often people are kind of seeking to kind of break away from. But just thinking about some of the nostalgias in the Tudor period after the Reformation, people started to express real nostalgia for what they called Merry England. And at first that was really associated, explicitly with the Catholic past. This kind of vanished time of saints' days and May games and communal festivities. And that was actually quite, controversial at a time when Britain was, fighting these huge battles over religion. That had quite dangerous political power because it was referring to a very concrete time within most people's living memories. But actually, as time went on, Merry England nostalgia became a much more kind of a way back when time of yore. And as it did so, it kind of became less and less of a real time. It was referring to a time far in the past, but it had an appeal precisely because it wasn't very accurate about that past. It became much more, the kind of Merry England that we associate with, like, kind of tales of Robin Hood and his merry men, or, in Shakespeare's As You Like It, the kind of forest garden.
I don't know whether you know about this, but did you ever come across the Merry England theme park of Sutton Coldfield? That they're planning to launch it in the 1960s, early 1970s, which was there's a guy called Warwick Charlton, who was PR man for Montgomery, and he was the person who brought the Mayflower. He made a replica of the Mayflower and sailed it across in the 50s. And he convinced some organised criminals. This is what this is what I'm working on at the moment, to put some money into this. And it is very much that kind of amalgam that you're talking about, where the Merry England idea, as you lay out very nicely in the book, about this kind of pre-Reformation Catholic England, it starts to embrace the post-Reformation Protestant England as well, in this sort of strange late medieval, early modern amalgam, which I think you can probably see the descendant in Camelot in Lancashire, another great odd theme park.
Gosh, the Merry England theme park. That's something out of a Julian Bond.
That's sort of what makes me. That makes me wonder. Sorry, I have a list of questions here. One of the things I was again thinking about that. And golden ages that people fix on. What do you think are perhaps the factors that lead particular times to appeal to another? So is it always the case that it's sort of a quite recent past that people are harking back to, or does it vary? And if so, are there any kind of factors that lead people to pick out a particular period that seems relevant to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think people always, kind of try and find an age that seems to contrast most starkly with their own in idealizing it.
Well, I'm struggling to hear you, Hannah. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you. Is that better? Can you hear me?
If you just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Well, I'm going to have to just see if I can...
I can pop... Let me know if you want me to try and headphone.
A moment. Right. Well, that's great that I can hear that everyone can hear me. Hannah, can you just say something so I can see if I can hear you?
Yeah, of course. I mean, shall I jump into answering the question?
I'm afraid this is seriously playing up at my end, everybody. I'm not entirely sure why.
Hi, Mark. I'm just going to interject there. Mark, would you be able to just check your...
What I'm going to suggest is that I'm just going to very briefly leave the Zoom and then come back, rejoin you, and we'll pick it up from there.
Okay.
But I'm going to pose you a question before I go, Hannah.
Go for it.
and it was so it's going back to that idea of why particular times are relevant to the particular presence that you're looking at. And are they and also to an extent, and this was a question that sort of pricked that came to me when reading, is at what point does something become nostalgic? So can we be nostalgic for something that happened last year?
Yeah.
In the sense that you talk about this in the book, or does it have to be something much more substantial or further back in time? So I'm going to sort of leave you to ponder that, and I'm going to rejoin in a moment. Sorry about this, everybody.
Yeah, I mean, to tackle the first part of Mark's question, I guess I'm going to give a little bit of a cop-out and say it can be both. I think people throughout history have often looked back and idealized times that seem to be the absolute opposite and the mirror image of their own societies. So I think a perfect example of that is the ways in which the Victorians idealized the Middle Ages. That, at a time of rapid urbanization and industrialization, when there were huge anxieties about the dark satanic mills swallowing up England's green and pleasant land, they look back to the Middle Ages and reimagined it as everything that their age was not. It was a time of beauty and social harmony set against kind of modern industrial ugliness and alienation. It was a time of community and sharing and neighborliness, in contrast to the kind of anonymity of industrial cities and the laissez-faire of industrialists. So they really kind of look back to the Middle Ages as something, is embodying a spirit that they felt was lacking in their society and they wanted to inject back in. But, I think at other times people have looked back to different ages in the distant past and they've idealized them precisely because they see themselves in them. So in the 18th century, In contrast to the Victorian era, people absolutely scorn the Middle Ages as this, dark age, supposed dark ages of barbarity and backwardness and religious superstition, that contrasted to their, supposed age of reason and progress. But they looked back with longing to classical Greece and Rome, and they kind of saw themselves as, the true heirs of, democracy and civilization that they saw embodied in classical culture. So yeah, a bit of both is my cop-out answer. And then Mark, to tackle the second part of your question, when is it possible to start being nostalgic? Is it, I think you said, can we be nostalgic for last year, say? I think we can be nostalgic for as soon as you like. And actually, to be honest, often we're nostalgic for things. It's almost a kind of anticipatory nostalgia for things that aren't quite yet over or things that we haven't quite yet lost. I think often that's the most kind of time we feel most poignant about nostalgia. Say like you're having an incredible time, you realize in the present, say on a personal level, that you're having this fantastic time, and you can kind of almost, I think, already feel like, oh, it's going to be over soon. I'll be feeling really nostalgic about it. But I think, on a historical level, something I talk about briefly in the conclusion of the book is the ways in which we feel nostalgia over climate change. Say like watching a David Attenborough documentary, when like the kind of very emotive images of, polar bears, clinging onto the kind of disappearing icebergs. And, I think we're really being invited there to feel nostalgia for things we haven't yet lost or that we're on the point of losing, and to kind of imagine the future nostalgia that we're going to feel. So, yeah.
But thinking, I'm just looking at, sorry for dropping out, everybody, that's looking at some of the questions that are coming in. There's some interesting ones to build on this from our audience. So thinking about one, for example, is, which I'll just pitch to you straight away, is thinking about nostalgia and how it plays currently. So what do you think nostalgia, how did nostalgia contribute to something like Brexit? How does it, and other things that are happening right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the kind of debates about imperial nostalgia around Brexit was one of the real impetuses for me writing the book. And, I was very interested to see the debates that were kind of playing out in the media in the wake of 2016. And this real sense that, Leavers and the Leave campaign were perhaps uniquely stuck in the past. That very quickly there became this kind of established media narrative that, Leave voters were uniquely stuck in the past. They were uniquely enthralled to a kind of lost era of power and pride. And, certainly a lot of Remainers felt that they were kind of failing to face the realities of how Britain's position in the world had changed. But actually, as I talk about in the book, I kind of also wanted to highlight that the Remain campaign was not by any means immune from nostalgia in the way that they articulated their vision for remaining in the EU. Whenever the Leave campaign, for instance, found Second World War veterans who, would kind of give pleas saying, we don't trust Europeans. That's why we went to fight the Germans, for our independence. And the Remain campaign would find veterans and they would say, no, we fought so that we would never again see Europe divided. And, a Leave vote would jeopardize the peace we had fought for. And I think as well, there was a lot of nostalgia among Remainers and evidence on kind of protest marches for a second referendum. It was a very kind of Paddington Bear, kind of Womble's vision of mid-century Britain. And, I think a way that the Remain campaign kind of, like unofficial efforts among Remainers kind of countered this, kind of nostalgic military chauvinism of Nigel Farage was to kind of come up with very quaint, faux archaic swear words like cotwomble and arse badger. So yeah, I was really fascinated by how that played out on both sides of the debate.
And was that what motivated the book, actually, that living through that moment for you? Is that what
Yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting, when I was shaping the proposal, a very interesting experience, because that was absolutely where the idea had begun. And then I was just kind of putting what I thought were the finishing touches to the proposal in March 2020. And then we looked down, and I think that it really made me reflect more on the personal dimensions of nostalgia. I think we all very quickly became intensely nostalgic for just the experience of normality itself. Kind of like nostalgia playlists on streaming channels registered like massive increases. The BBC reran like fondly remembered sporting victories. They reran the Olympic opening ceremony, which of course was itself nostalgic. And then of course immediately, the kind of Blitz spirit was reached for, kind of reflexively, which made a great deal of sense when purchases of like essential goods were being restricted, and we were being kind of legally restricted on when we could leave the house. It absolutely, of course, made sense to look back to the last time in living memory people experienced restrictions like that. But again, I became fascinated by how it was playing out on both sides of the debate. So one vision of what the Blitz spirit, or the kind of keep calm and carry on spirit, meant was to kind of say, it was used as an argument for like no restrictions whatsoever. Keep calm and carry on for a lot of Telegraph columnists meant no lockdown, carry on as normal, stiff upper lip. But then very quickly, a kind of rival vision of what keep calm and carry on and what the Blitz spirit meant was articulated. So Matt Hancock, when he was announcing the government's coronavirus bill that kind of brought in the first restrictions, was saying, our generation has never been tested like this, but our grandparents' generation has. And, we can draw on these British values, we can come together and accept restrictions. The Queen channeled, Virulence will meet again as a kind of vision for just accepting, and going into lockdown.
I did wonder this as I was reading as well. What makes that nostalgic as opposed to just engaging with the past? I mean, because is nostalgia part of this, or is it all of it? I mean, how do you distinguish it from people just going, this is an argument about what happened recently and how we might learn?
Yeah. I mean, I use often in the book nostalgia in like the broadest sense to be a kind of cozy engagement with history. And I think it's absolutely open to debate, how much some of these things are nostalgia. But, I think especially with the Blitz spirit, what people look back to is an incredibly idealized image of the Second World War that actually has a lot of the war removed. There's very little remembrance of the toll that war took on people. When people invoke the Blitz spirit, it's war becomes an object lesson in bringing out the best in people. And there's a tendency to kind of look back to people as if they were character actors in this production of like muddling through in the face of adversity. And I think I wanted to highlight in the book, like, not only did that nostalgia create real problems for how we imagined how to deal with a very different crisis in COVID, but it also did a real disservice to people's experiences in the past themselves. Even as invocation of the Blitz spirit purport to kind of honor people that lived through the war, it kind of really like flattens out their emotional experience into kind of something that can become weaponized to serve a political agenda. As I saw it, that's not an engagement with history, that's an exercise in nostalgia.
So thinking about, again, sort of returning to the issue of nostalgia, and how does it sit then? I mean, how important do you think it is politically relative to other things, particularly, say, for example, its opposite, neophilia? And so, I mean, the obsession with the present and the future in particular, and the new. I mean, how do you see these things interacting? Because, of course, it's a book about nostalgia. It's a slightly unfair question. It's a book about nostalgia. And so of course it's going to dominate. But are there times when the nostalgia is present, but perhaps not as important as neophilia or other things?
Well, again, I'm not sure as I see it as an either or. I think something I kind of wanted to highlight in the book was that often the times in which people have most intensely evoked nostalgia have been times where people have really embraced progress or, and or change. I mean, obviously change isn't necessarily the same as progress, but, people have really looked to the new at the same time as looking back to the past. Sometimes for inspiration, sometimes for a sense of kind of compensation. But I think for example, I think no era has been more obsessed with history than Britain of the 1840s. Kind of medievalism is just kind of gone a bit haywire. There's kind of no nook or cranny of popular culture where historical themes can't be found. Walter Scott's novels are runaway bestsellers. They're pre-Raphaelite painters, and like Tennyson are evoking kind of Arthurian legends and chivalry. But this was an age of enormous pride and faith in progress. Britain was being rapidly transformed by people who thought industrialization was a good thing and would lead to progress. There was huge pride in Britain being the kind of workshop of the world. So, I think these things often go hand in hand. And, particularly the ways in which nostalgia is evoked by politicians, it's very often deceptively traditionalist. Often people invoking images of British tradition are the ones actually pursuing very rapid and transformative change.
Well, absolutely.
For instance, at the moment they have very little respect for kind of institutional traditions. They're very happily attacking bishops and the heir to the throne over their stance on Rwanda. Not very happy with universities or the civil service. Kind of lots of traditions are being attacked and undermined at the same time as they're kind of seemingly superficially drawing on pride in these very same traditions.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a question that I wish someone had asked me, but which was about you. Your book's been out for a couple of months now. You've had some reviews. What did you make of the reviews? Do they misunderstand you? Is there anything you'd like to kind of have this right of reply to say, no, I didn't mean that?
Oh, that's a good question. I think on the whole, I've had some nice reviews. It's been a very strange experience seeing them, but very nice. Tim Stanley reviewed me in the Telegraph and wasn't very happy with me because he felt that I'd called him a fascist, but I'd made what I thought was a very benign point about how the right-wing media kind of draw on these kind of great and glorious myths of British history, and historically nationalists and racists have drawn on these exact same myths, and that I think it's kind of concerning when we have a national media that is more invested in upholding those foundation myths and kind of pushing the idea that historians and heritage workers that seek to actually shed light on the past are kind of smeared as Marxist ideologues or cancel culture made manifest. And I just said, honestly, that sounds a bit fashy to me. And I think Tim Stanley decided to take it very personally. But I still got 3 stars though, so
there you go. No, I'm just getting one of the things I was sort of wanting to ask you that was just to sort of get a sense of. I knew that review and I wondered what you made of it. But one of the points he was making there, it's a more general one, is nostalgia, as you just mentioned, is it something that's more associated with the right than it is with the left in politics? And is that fair? The left just as obsessed with a past, but perhaps a different past.
Yeah, they absolutely are. I think, as kind of 2 examples at the moment, the nostalgia of the Labour right for the successes of the Blair years and the nostalgia of Corbynites for, the post-war consensus and, kind of the strength of trade unions in the 1970s. So I think often the future of labour has been presented in terms of two different nostalgic visions of two different decades. We actually, historically, the political left has, quite consciously evoked nostalgia for quite radical and revolutionary ends. So in the late 19th century, for example, socialists like William Morris are, invoking their kind of image of future utopia through images of, this very idealized kind of pastoral Britain, of, kind of communist communitarian villages. In the earlier 19th century, Chartists were, as they were demanding men's right to political participation, they were articulating their calls for change and reform through images of Merry England, which, they kind of presented as, this golden age for the dignity and rights of working men, a time when people kind of owned their own land and, had a shared investment in the nation. And, through that, they could say, well, we're not dangerous radicals. We're the custodians of and the restorers of British tradition. So absolutely, it cuts across the political spectrum.
So what do you think? I mean, what do you think historians' relationship with nostalgia should be? Are we there to debunk it? Are we there to explain it, understand it? I mean, what's our relationship?
All of the above, I think.
All of the above. Yeah.
I mean, definitely all of the above, but I think particularly at the moment, I think we're in quite dangerous territory. I think in the ways in which politicians and the media are presenting a very particular narrative of British history. And, they're very explicitly doing that to, I think, create a false political consensus. A certain perspective on British history is now a literal requirement for acquiring British citizenship. Hundreds of historians signed this open letter, I think a couple of years ago, saying, that the life in the UK test, it's a horrendously distorted vision of the past, that kind of quite hysterically elevates Britain to, the source of all that is good in the world. In ways that are just, at several points, just factually wrong. And, actually, it turns out the government have now acknowledged that in the handbook and said, it's been pointed out that a few of these questions don't quite align with fact. But if in doubt, stick with the official version of history we're teaching you, really telling on themselves. So I think how do we as historians counter that? I think one thing I think we need to get better at is showing people that changing your mind isn't an existential threat. It doesn't, giving up an idea that British history fills you with pride doesn't mean that you have to feel intense shame instead. There is a middle ground where we can just learn that the stories we were first taught, as children and school children, aren't the same as history, as like an analytic academic discipline. And that actually, there is nothing new. There's this idea in the media that, kind of historians are rewriting history at the moment. And you think, well, that's the definition of the profession. Every age has reinterpreted the past and lighted the present. The sky will not fall down if we challenge some of these myths about British history.
I'm just picking up a question from the audience here, from Serena, which I kind of think, in a sense, speaks to this as well. So there's a kind of there's an issue that's lurking behind this, which is, again, it's a bit of a binary. I mean, is there a good nostalgia, a bad nostalgia? Does nostalgia? I mean, can we approach it and say, well, actually, this can serve quite useful purposes, yes, both individually, psychologically, socially? I mean,
100%. I say in the conclusion of the book, I'm really not arguing that nostalgia is something we should seek to do away with. It's absolutely, a crucial, fundamental human emotion. And, psychologists and sociologists, for instance, will talk about how actually nostalgia is great for our mental health. When we look back to memories where we feel happy and we feel at home, and we create stories that kind of root ourselves and anchor ourselves in the past, we feel happier, more connected to others, but also paradoxically more ready to face the future, more ready to jump into the unknown, because we think we have a stable base that we can return to. So
that's a fascinating point.
I think, as I said at the beginning, but I kind of want to reiterate again, I think that is different to having nostalgia for British history and mapping this deep human need that we all have onto needing a feel-good version of the national past.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, it's fascinating how I think the past is people's individual past is being used when tackling issues around dementia, and how that's being used, and it being in a really positive way. But that again, raises an issue that I was just wondering if you would talk a little bit about with us, which is about the relationship between individual feelings of nostalgia and a kind of collective nostalgia, and how these two things interact with one another.
Yeah, of course, it's not just as simple as separating the individual from the national, because we are all part of a patchwork of overlapping identities, as individuals, as part of families, as part of professional communities, local communities, and then national and maybe international communities. So of course all these things are really interlinked, and I think a theme I did pick up in the book in a couple of chapters was often the ways in which the past, or like British history, is conflated with people's experiences as children, and that often people will look back to the world as it was when they were children and kind of confuse the experience of being a child with what the world was like at the time. That was, I think, partly at play in the way that Margaret Thatcher invoked Victorian values as a kind of medicine for the 1980s. A lot of historians at the time kind of said, well, doesn't sound like a lot of this has much to do with Victorian era. It just kind of sounds like a byword for traditional. You're talking about like family values, respecting the police, respecting authority, working hard. That's not inherently Victorian. And when she was asked that in an interview once, she said, oh, well, they said kind of, what is Victorian about your values? And she said, I was raised by a Victorian grandmother in Grantham. And she kind of went into a great deal about, the kind of lessons in ethics that her father and grandmother taught her. And I think there is a real sense in which, the Victorian era became a kind of shining world constructed out of what she was taught as a child. And then I picked up on that again in my late Victorian and Edwardian chapter. And I looked at, in this kind of heyday of children's literature, this kind of pastoral heyday of children's literature with like The Wind in the Willows, Peter Pan, The Railway Children, how actually a lot of authors, when they look back to their childhoods, they were remembering natural landscapes that were often no longer physically there, because it was such an age of rapid urbanization and industrialization. So H.G. Wells, in his like autobiographical novel, The New Machiavelli, talks about growing up in Bromley, which then was a kind of, as he told it, like a semi-rural idyll. And he said, the experience of his childhood was just watching this landscape progressively destroyed by jerry builders. So he is looking back to like a physical lost Eden as he saw it. And that was a very, very common experience for people growing, up around the turn of the 20th century. But there was in turn a real tendency to look back to a more rural Britain and really identify it with the kind of magic of a child's imagination and see it as a kind of pure and of an innocent time, and a time when a time of kind of play and rest and leisure, rather than one of kind of backbreaking toil, which of course characterized life in reality.
Which is one of the lovely bits of the book. I'm conscious that we need to broaden our conversation and bring in some of the audience, and so I'm going to just read through the questions briefly, but as I do, I'm going to pose you one last one, while I do this, which is, so, I mean, what period are you nostalgic about?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I think like a lot of people, I'm often nostalgic for times that I have not myself experienced. I don't know if everyone can see that I've got Roxy Music's Country Life behind me. I'm quite into like the music of my parents' generation. I think the 70s culturally looks pretty great from where I'm sitting, also in terms of, standards of living, the kind of imminent arrival of the leisure society, as everyone was told was coming in the 1970s. I think there's a lot to look back and be nostalgic for, but maybe once the winter of discontent Mark II starts to bite, I might feel very differently about the idea of the 70s.
I've got a question here from Saksham. How has nostalgia changed with the availability of the internet?
Yeah, it's such a fascinating question. It's not something I look at a huge amount in the book. I wish I'd had more time for, but it was a big theme. I think it was a really kind of shaping influence on the culture of the 2000s. The kind of first age of the omnipresent internet. I think there was suddenly a real nostalgia for physical things. It seems like a very long time ago now, but do you remember the conversations we had about the hipster and trying to define what hipsters were? And it seemed to center around people being very annoyed that they were kind of performatively appropriating, oldie analog technologies, kind of collecting vintage records, using print cameras instead of digital photography, salvaging some Victorian copper for a microbrewery, et cetera, et cetera. And, they came in for a lot of mockery for that at the time. But, I think there was something very natural about that impulse, in a digital economy that was presenting like quite a bewildering variety of choice. I think in some ways it makes sense to then look back to a kind of more kind of, bric-a-brac, raiding vintage stores for found objects. And, in a world where we can purchase like any song on screen almost instantly, or, save, an almost infinite number of photos, it made real sense to want to hold on to the value of things. So I think that's part of the story of how the internet's changed things. And I think the other obvious one is that we can access the look of a vast range of time periods almost instantly. And I think kind of calling back to something I talked about at the beginning of the session, it's leading to a kind of strange flattening of time where I'm not sure quite exactly what it is we're looking back to. And there's often several layers of nostalgia for different time periods all at once. And, we are looking back to nostalgic moments themselves and then feeling nostalgic for that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think picking up on the back of that, there's a question here from Rory, which sort of, I'm going to paraphrase it. It asks about commercialization and when nostalgia is commercialized. Is that a really recent phenomenon, or is that something that you see going much further back?
That's such a great question. I'm so glad. Is it Rory? I'm so glad you asked that. It turns out a very long time. Something I look at in the book is late Victorian and Edwardian advertising. So it's this kind of first era where mass-produced goods are widely available and affordable. This is a time when disposable incomes are becoming available to kind of most of the working class. And you kind of might think in a way these, brand new mass-produced products that are produced by cutting-edge technologies might kind of celebrate their modernity. But that's actually not what happens. This is the very first age in which advertisers are starting to get a bit canny and realize that they can exploit consumer emotions, that rather than just kind of giving straight information about their products, they can really kind of pull on people's emotions, in ways that aren't in any way regulated by an industry body. So they can really twist the knife in. But what they absolutely latch onto is the power of nostalgia to shift goods. And I think that, there's a real irony that kind of masking the mass-produced nature of their own products, and kind of, they, like, advertisements would be set in, classical antiquity, the Middle Ages, a kind of older pastoral Britain, like any historical or nostalgic scene you can imagine, products were set in it, and it was kind of promised, like, to paying customers, that they could kind of recapture the essence of that era through consumption.
Returning to sort of the political uses of nostalgia, we've got several questions from a variety of audience members that sort of speak to aspects of this. So I'm going to try and pull them together. I hope they don't mind. She's asking about how far nostalgia is inherently tied up with nationalism, national identity, and whether it can be more, whether it be separated, and when you can attach it to the international, the transnational. I mean, is it always a national oriented thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think nationalism is always really intertwined with nostalgia. The nations people imagine have origin stories that kind of reach back into kind of misty, mythic origins, where the pull of geography kind of trumps all else. That we are asked to identify with people who shared our geographical homelands long ago, even though their views, values, customs, even language were wildly different. I think no nationalist has ever woken up on any given day and said, this is the quintessentially national time for us. It's always, the essence of national identity is always located in the past, when people were supposedly more bounded, more united, singing from the same national hymn sheet. But I think there are often different visions within that. And I think historically, at the moment, I think nationalist nostalgias are tied to a very top-down vision of British history. It's literally being shaped by, a handful of former Etonians in government at the moment. But, historically, that hasn't always been the case. In the 19th century, there were, like, not only in Britain, in countries across Europe, there were kind of waves of romantic nationalism where, they were kind of locating the essence of national identity more in, like, shared vernacular traditions. And that was often allied with democratic movements and revolutions that overthrew, traditional social structures like monarchy and aristocracy. In Britain, ruling elites were initially quite suspicious that, working men and women were taking such a voracious interest in, like Britain's tradition and vernacular culture, because they thought, well, does that mean they're trying to take control of the national narrative? And people, kind of pushing for democracy were precisely invoking these images of tradition because it was a safe way to demand change. I think probably, I am a British historian, I should say. I'm absolutely not a global historian, so I feel like I can't really say with any confidence that no country doesn't, has a nationalism that isn't nostalgic. I think probably they're all nostalgic, but, that doesn't need to be allied to a conservative top-down vision of national history.
Now, I'm very conscious that we've got a limited amount of time left, so I think I'm going to be able to ask take one more question from the audience's questions. So I apologise to those of you who don't feel your question has been answered, but I urge you to go and read Hannah's book because many of them are answered there. This is one from Anonymous. Is the pernicious kind of nostalgia you're talking about so merely a disingenuous politicising of the past? Is there a place for nostalgia, that is to say, a place for nostalgia in politics and value on political philosophy to draw on the past? So it's, I think, putting it in a positive light. How does it work positively?
Yeah, I mean, the pernicious disingenuous, I think, is a very good question. It's something I really asked myself when I was writing the book, because I think, it is axiomatic that the culture wars pursued by the government at the moment are a distraction manufactured to deflect attention from more substantial political failings, and that it's quite a kind of cheap populist way of divide and rule. But absolutely at the same time, I think we do also recognize that it isn't 100% disingenuous, that in some way these myths about British history are deeply felt and sincerely believed, especially by often a ruling elite that went to a governing elite that went to a top handful of public schools where they were explicitly told to kind of emulate their ancestors and grandfathers and forefathers' example. People were explicitly imbued with a sense of you're inheriting the kind of governing torch from people that ruled a quarter of the world, and you have to go out and kind of find your own way in that. So I have no doubt that in many ways Boris Johnson really sincerely believes, for example, a lot of what he's saying about British history, even though he also kind of in a lot of ways does know better, having had an Oxford education. But yeah, is there a more positive vision as well as the pernicious? Yeah, I think there is. And, I think one we're all very familiar with is the Olympic opening ceremony. Also a kind of grandly romantic story of pride and progress, but it was much more focused on people power, of, a sense that, Britain's political system was shaped by, hard-won rights that were fought for by the people. And celebrations of key workers in the NHS. That ceremony was intensely nostalgic, but also perfectly compatible with a kind of inclusive, progressive political agenda.
No, thank you, Hannah. A question occurred to me. I'm going to pose it, but don't answer it because we haven't got time. But Kwasi Kwarteng, University Challenge panellist and published historian and business minister. I wonder what he makes of what's going on with our current government and its attitude to the past. But I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank Hannah for just sparing her time this evening to share with us her thoughts about nostalgia, and urge you to read Rule Nostalgia. It's a fascinating book. I've learned so much, particularly about, for me, an earlier period. I studied the 20th century, but there's so much in here about the 19th and the 18th century and earlier that we barely touched upon. Please do think about getting hold of a copy. If you would like to purchase a copy of Hannah's book, you can. It will be available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. For more information on book sales, you can see the festival website. I think one of my colleagues is going to put something in the chat now with a link as well to their website.
Oh, fantastic.
The other thing I was going to say is the recording of this event is going to be available to watch on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival website after the 24th of June. You'll be contacted by email when the video is available to view. And finally, we very much hope that you've enjoyed this evening's talk and that you'll continue to be engaged with the York Festival of Ideas over the next couple of weeks. Check out our website, which is yorkfestivalofideas.com, for full details of all the kind of events that are coming up in the festival programme, some in person, some online like this one. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on these events and continue this conversation beyond Zoom on Twitter using the hashtag #YorkIdeas. So thank you very much, and thank you again, Hannah. And I'm going to clap on behalf of everyone else here.
Thank you for having me.
No, thank you.
Thank you.